Hello, my name's Janet Bolitho, and I look forward to walking with you through Montague, a community lost and found. I'm just going to pause a minute to share my screen. On behalf of the City of Port Phillip and Open House Melbourne, I'd like to welcome you to this virtual guided tour of Montague. But before we begin, I'd like to make some acknowledgements. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and on which we'll walk, the Yalukit Willem clan of the Bunurong. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledging their ongoing and continuing relationship to this land. I'd like to acknowledge the City of Port Phillip for curating the wonderful exhibition, Montague, a community lost and found. And I'd particularly like to thank all former residents of Montague who've shared their life stories and their photographs to enrich the walk we'll take today. I always like to begin a walk in our area with Cox's chart of 1864. There's much to read in this chart, but I confine myself to pointing out a few features. There's the Yarra River. See its sinuous winding course. The Hoddle's grid, the grid of Melbourne, laid out on top of that landscape. And see all this wet land here in two ways. There's the rich, productive Yarra Delta that sustained the people of the Kulin Nation, or an impediment to development as colonists saw it. But our walk today will be within this red circle, the area of Montague. And a few things to note. The railway line that runs through it is the same line as the 109 Port Melbourne Light Rail line. Stop 126 is around here, the former Montague railway station. But note particularly the proximity to the Yarra River, and also see that among the many wet places, this watery area, which is Montague, and remains relevant to the suburb today. Let's look at this from a different point of view. This is an aerial photograph taken by Charles Daniel Pratt around 1940. We'll be exploring within the confines of that red line, but just look a little at some of the relationships. Once again, that proximity to the Yarra River, the factories on the other side of the railway line. And just take a look at this bridge and this double-storey building on the right bottom hand of the photograph. We're going to begin here. This is at that spot where we meet on the Port Melbourne side of Montague. So Montague was separated from Port Melbourne by just one street, Boundary Street. Here we see Fred Nicholson as a baby with his mother and their dog, just next to that railway, that overpass, which workers could take to the factories over the line. Now, one thing that is always observed when people talk about Montague was how bounded it was, how contained. It was a very small suburb of South Melbourne. So its boundaries were the railway line, which we've just mentioned, Ferrers Street, City Road, and Boundary Street. And our walk begins just here. And that double-storey building, that's here. So let's go on. So double-storey building was Pop Roberts' shop, a grocer's shop. And he was like the grocer to the whole of Gladstone Street. This is where people did their weekly shopping, and he presented them with a weekly account. He was well known to all the families and all the children in the street. Marlene Bailey recalls leaving her orange there on the way to school on a hot summer's day, and he'd put it in the freezer and give it back to her at the end of the day. But something that's so striking about this photograph is all the houses. If you were to return to the street today, a mere handful of houses remain, just a smattering. But Gladstone Street was densely inhabited. In these small houses were families well known to one another. Often there were many relationships, many people were related. And in the small houses, people often had to make do with such accommodation as there was. So quite often people would sleep on the verandas, as is indicated here, because some of the houses only had 2 rooms or so. But you can, if you were to look at an old photograph of Port Melbourne or Albert Park from yesteryear, it's not dissimilar to what you would have seen there. And when you talk to former residents of Montague, their first observation is often, it was houses, it was all houses, they repeat again and again, but few of those houses remain. Gladstone Street in Montague had a rich community life, including a Presbyterian church and hall where many social activities took place and from which many excursions set forth. And just up the road here, just beyond this point, was where Hughie Sykes, here on the bottom right hand of the photograph, where he lived with his wife, his son and daughter, and their many children. Sykes worked on the waterfront. Here he is with his gang. At this time, he was a coalie. He worked exclusively on the coal. Let's take a bit closer look at Hughie Sykes, who was a legend on the waterfront. He continued working there on the river wharf until he was 87, when he died in an accident going to work crossing the Yarra River. And when he died, so well known and well regarded was he that mourners lined up the length of Gladstone Street back to Montague Street, way back up Montague Street towards City Road. So these men who worked on the waterfront were immensely strong. And Daniel Monagle, who also worked on the waterfront, was known to go off to a boxing bout on a day at the wharf. But it was hazardous work. The coal had to be shoveled into baskets in the hold of the ship. You can imagine the air quality was shocking. And then that coal had to be slung in baskets onto the deck and thence onto the wharf. It was a very dangerous occupation, very tough indeed. Now, just metres away from where the Sykeses lived, this is near the corner of Montague Street and Gladstone Lane, and just below the Montague railway station, what's now stop 126 on the 109. You can see the brick retaining wall of the station. And the children quite clearly delighted playing in the floodwaters that often used to gather at this point when a high tide and heavy rain coincided. And so does the floodwater still come today. So while it was fun for the children, it must have been very difficult living in those damp houses which flooded from time to time. If you see where this lad's feet are hanging over the ramp, we're just going to walk up the ramp now to the top of the station and look out. Here we're looking towards South Melbourne Marketish, down Montague Street towards City Road. And I'd like to point out a few things. In particular, note the shop with the Robo sign. Once again, that would have serviced many families who lived on the other side of Gladstone Street. But take particular note. Then here we see this very fine police station, indicating that the presence of police was important in Montague. And further down Montague Street, again towards City Road, on the corner of Buckhurst Street, St Barnabas Church. And this photograph, taken in the 50s, indicates a few cars, but not many. Now we'll look the other way, towards the wharf, towards the river. And front and centre in this photograph is the Montague Bridge, into which trucks are prone to drive. And you can see how low that bridge is. The background to my screen is actually taken from the bricks here under the Montague Street Bridge. And it was here that boys would sell newspapers to the many, many workers making their way to the Dunlop factory. The curious thing about this photograph is how depopulated it is, because you can be sure that Montague Street was always a hive of activity with people going to work, coming and going to work, or making their way to the wharf. Now, Dunlop's, just this building remains, the one on the corner of Montague and Normanby Road, but it's just a remnant. Dunlop's was once a much more extensive operation, as this photograph we saw before illustrates. And I'm just going to indicate the extent of Dunlop's operation. And you might also note here the chimneys bearing the name Dunlop, and then there's another chimney over here, just indicating that all these factories were powered by coal, that coal that came in from nearby South Wharf. And paradoxically, when those chimneys were belching smoke, it was a good sign, because it was a sign the factories were operating and that they were in full production. Worse was when no smoke issued from those chimneys, because it meant there was no work. And that could be because there was a coal strike at the wharf, or the supply of coal from New South Wales was very erratic. So paradoxically, the smoke from that chimney was a sign of the health of the industries that were operating there. Now, Dunlops came to occupy this site on the south bank of the river. They were formerly in Melbourne itself, but they wanted larger premises because they were wanting to meet the insatiable demand in the late 1890s for bicycle tyres. Bicycling was a craze at that time. And so they wanted a site that was far enough away not to be troublesome with all the smoke and so on, but close enough to be near the wharves and sources of and ways of distributing their products. And they say that in order to fend off any possible coal shortages, Dunlop's kept a huge supply of coal in reserve, so it resembled a mini coal mine. Now, here we see an interior shot of the Dunlop's factory, and they made so many different tyres here. Said by 1920, Dunlop was making 58 different kinds of car tyres. And it was a labour-intensive business. You can see both women and men at work in these tables making the tyres. And once again, the working conditions in the factory wouldn't have been great. But rubber was the wonder material of the day. It was very versatile, very adaptable, could be used for a range of purposes. And each product had a distinctive requirement for particular blends of rubber, and the recipes were known only to the manager. He kept it all in his head. And so the directors requested that he write all those recipes into a book should he be hit by a bus or similar. And so here is just one recipe that was in that book for Doughty tyres. For 5 pounds of fine para rubber, 10 pounds of Rambong and Peruvian rubber, 6 pounds of pure gum, 4 of litharge, 4 of Lugo, and 3 of sulphur. Such was the arcane recipe, with these ingredients sourced from countries as far afield as Peru and other places in South America. Once again, they came in at South Wharf. And this precious recipe book was secured in a safe and sealed with wax, and only to be opened with the consent of the directors. So we leave Dunlop's now to cross the road, cross Montague Street at Normanby Road, where there was another extensive sprawling factory, Laconia, Laycock Woolen Mills. This beautiful advertisement from the 50s, so soft, so pastel, belied the reality that Laconia was also a very dirty, noisy place. The looms rattled, it was deafening inside, and it was very, very smelly. Industrial accidents in all these factories was not uncommon, and Mr. Rodder, who lived nearby, lost his arm in one of the looms. But unlike today, many employees worked their whole lives in one place, and he was looked after by his employers and continued working even after he lost his arm. And it was quite common for several generations to work in the same factory. And both Dunlop's and Laconia were essential industries during the war, highly strategic industries, and vulnerable when Australia was experiencing the threat of invasion in the early months of 1942. Now we continue down Montague Street, but on the other side of the road now, and just ask you to take a look at this house on the right, which looks a little bit like the houses we saw on the other side of Gladstone Street. But being where they were, they flooded regularly, they were damp, they were dark, they were decaying. And for many, many years, there was a campaign for something to be done. And as with issues and campaigns today, it takes many, many years of advocacy and campaigning for issues to be addressed. And in this case, the resolution came from a new innovation and a partnership between the South Melbourne Council, in whose jurisdiction Montague fell, and the State Savings Bank of Victoria, to clear these houses and replace them with new ones. The word used at the time was resume the houses. So this is what those houses were replaced with. bright, clean, and modern housing with bathrooms inside. Before, it would have been rare for a house in Montague to have a bathroom inside. And there's something about the spareness of this font which reflects that sort of very modern, functional approach. Now, it's said that many of the people whose houses were demolished in order for this housing to be created didn't return here. The houses were too expensive for them. And so there was some criticism in that regard. Nevertheless, this scheme entered into by the South Melbourne Council, where they did all the drainage works and the State Savings Bank made the finance available and enabled the houses to be built. A very important relationship and one to be drawn upon in future planning for this area. A bit further down Montague Street on the Port Melbourne side is the Montague School. Now, the school was built in the 1890s in anticipation of the population that would follow the railway line that had, not the railway line, but the station that had opened in Montague. Now, the course of the school was to follow a rather different path, because in the early 1900s it was recognised that special dedicated schools were needed for children with disabilities. And at this time, children from the south of the river were conveyed by horse and cart to Fitzroy, to the special school there. And in recognition of the need for such a school in this area, Montague became a special school in 1915. In 1919, at the height of the Spanish flu pandemic, the school was made available as an emergency hospital. And once again, in the 1930s, when the polio epidemic was very severe in South Melbourne, the Montague School was used as an infantile polio clinic. So Montague continues as a special school today, specialising in vocational education and training for students in the latter part of secondary school. In the corner of Montague School was a community room that was well used especially by the boys in Montague, for learning skills such as woodwork, bootsmithing, and later on things to do with cars. On the opposite corner of Buckhurst Street and Montague Street was the Golden Fleece Hotel. Alcohol was a big part of life in Montague. Wharfies drank at this pub because it was so close to the river wharves. And children remember waiting on the footpath with their feet dangling in the gutter, waiting for their fathers to come out of the pub at 6 o'clock closing, and perhaps to guide them home. There was also sly grog available just down the road. And this is where Nappy Ollington, the former footballer and boxer, learnt his trade at Two Up. So Two Up School is big here too. So each of these corners had a nickname. So Montague, the school was referred to as Education. This was referred to as Damnation. And now we move to the third corner. And this was Salvation, St. Barnabas Church. Now, what's striking about this slide is, first of all, the garden in the foreground, because for those of you who are familiar with Montague Street today, there's barely a blade of grass, no big trees like this. And the church sat in a garden setting, as not uncommon with churches, but also look at the how substantial the church was. You know, it's beautiful roof and stained glass windows. And St. Barnabas was, as many churches are, a centre for community life. But its large grounds also made possible the siting of the very first free kindergarten in all Victoria in the grounds of the church. Lady Northcote, the wife of the governor, was a passionate believer in early childhood education, and she campaigned long and hard to establish this kindergarten. So many parents in Montague, most of them were working, and the children, you know, were left pretty much to fend for themselves. And this kindergarten provided a very valuable community service, largely funded and staffed by Lady Northcote's friends from Toorak. But her observation that investment in early childhood is one of the best predictors and enablers of outcomes later in life has only been borne out by subsequent research. We continue along Buckhurst Street, and this building, which is now Print Mint, was formerly Milson's Confectionary. So you can imagine that that was a popular place in the neighbourhood. And if we just go round the corner here into George Street, there was a little window in the wall here where children were able to get barley sugars from the confectionery place. And although today George Street just looks like a service road where people access garages, in the 50s, this was a place where people lived. There were 6 houses in George Street, and former residents can remember each household. And this was the way that children made their way between the various streets to join with their friends. So we go along George Street to come out at Thistlethwaite Street and meet Terry Page on his bicycle. So in the early 50s, the streets were the playgrounds of Montague. This is where children played, where they gathered with their friends, where they hung out. They often say they didn't come in, you know, until they were called in for tea. It was a very peopled place. At that time, in the late 50s, a Melbourne newspaper ran a competition for how many children lived in any one street in Melbourne. And in Montague, each of those streets, Gladstone, Buckhurst and Thistlethwaite, submitted an entry. So here you see the children of Buckhurst Street with their mothers principally, and perhaps a grandmother or two, having their photograph for the paper. And I think, but not 100% sure, that it was actually Thistlethwaite Street that won the competition, and the prize was an absolutely splendid day out at Luna Park. In Thistlethwaite Street, there were 90 children living in just 28 houses in 100 yards. So what happened? Where did all these houses go? Where did the people go? How did this area change so dramatically? I think there were a range of reasons rather than just one. Talked about those industries, Dunlop, Laycox, Union Can. And during the war, those factories were all at peak production. But I imagine that after the war, production scaled back a little bit. When people grew up and got married, they tended to move out of Montague, you know, to suburbs with gardens, etc. And some of them, including people in Thistlethwaite Street, moved to the new Housing Commission estate in Port Melbourne at Fisherman's Bend. Also, things were changing on the waterfront. Rather than relying on men's labour, backbreaking labour like with Huey Sykes, the port was moving more and more towards unitisation, putting things in boxes as a precursor to containerisation. Many of the houses in Montague were rented, and it is said by some that pressure was exerted on some of those residents to move out. And gradually, things began to change. The suburb that had once been called by a former resident complete, where people stuck together like glue, it began to fray. The more people moved out, the more other people moved out until, and I hope you'll watch the film in the exhibition, Ken Page and his family were the last house left standing, and this close community had eroded to such an extent that it really became, there was no option for people but to leave. And then Montague was taken over by industry. That was where the value was at that time. The pressure was on to rezone the area for industry, and industries took the place of these houses. Another factor was well illustrated in this photograph. You see elderly Mrs. Lewis to the right and talking over the fence with her young Greek neighbours. In the post-war migration period, many Greek migrants moved to Montague. It was close to work and the housing was cheap. And as older people died, perhaps their houses decayed and were then demolished. So then in the 20 most recent years, Montague's been home to a thriving collection of businesses devoted to motor cars in one way or another. So panel beating, painting, car hire, some amazing range of vehicle-related businesses, and really thriving with it. And I love this picture in the middle, which shows this business with a sense of history, established in 1999, South Melbourne Motors. But the sort of writing was a bit on the wall for Montague because, so close to the city, land, high values, things were sort of heading towards a change. But another factor that caused the erosion of Montague was when Montague Street itself was designated the preferred access way to the Westgate Freeway. So it went from being like a neighbourhood shopping strip to being a road that carried, in recent times, up to 40,000 vehicles a day. So Montague Street effectively, broke Montague in half. It separated it in two. And, it's very difficult as a pedestrian to cross Montague Street because the prevailing lights favour car traffic. So the next big change ahead for Montague was in 2012, when the then Victorian government, under Planning Minister Matthew Guy, rezoned Fisherman's Bend as a site for urban renewal. Montague was caught up in this rezoning, even though Montague had historically never been part of Fisherman's Bend, and it explains why Montague's got a rather different character to the other rezoned precincts. The rezoning was to Capital City, which is a very permissive and enabling zoning in the Victorian planning scheme. meaning the sort of densities and heights contemplated in the capital city could also apply here. So some developers applied for permits really soon after the rezoning and got their permits, and this slide on the left shows the Gravity Tower, which was one of the first permits to be issued in the newly rezoned Fisherman's Bend, a 29-level tower. Now, do you remember we pointed out the Robur sign, which would have been just about here? That's the same location. And as you can see, nothing much has changed. This area remains prone to flooding. It shows cars making their way through floodwater in December 2018. And you may be interested in this sort of curious arrangement of poles on the right, but what this reflects is that, everybody involved with Fisherman's Bend is cognizant of this area's proneness to flooding, and Melbourne Water, who manage the planning for such matters, directed that the floor levels of the Gravity Tower should be set at 2.4 metres AHD, so that, in the event of a flood, the ground level would not be, the water could just wash through. And this is why you've got this arrangement of poles. And you'll find that the access to the tower is by a series of stairs. So preparing for future flooding has been planned for here, but it has meant that the street level experience is not very satisfactory. So then there was an outcry about the situation, about the planning arrangements that had been put in place, because there was no mechanism to capture the uplift in property values for community benefit. So when the new Labor government was elected in 2014, they undertook to revisit the planning for Fisherman's Bend and respond to the community demand that community facilities, schools, parks, etc., be the centerpieces in the planning for Fisherman's Bend. So by 2018, the new South Melbourne Primary School was opened, the first vertical school in Victoria. And were you to enter the school, which is via stairs here, you'll see inside a kind of almost like a terrace, some steps where families can enter the school and, have their last goodbyes before entering the classroom. And the first principal of South Melbourne Primary School would be at the door of the school every day to greet the new families as they came in, because children attend the school from many different nations and many different languages are spoken here. And this is the first place of community that they encounter. Now, the approach to the school on this pathway is through a newly created park from land that was acquired. And this park is called Kirrip Park in the language of the Bunurong. Kirrip meaning mate, suggesting that many friendships will be formed in this park. And it's very delightful indeed to see children from the primary school playing in the park. Here's another view of the park. On the right is the red brick Union Can Factory, where cans were made for canned food during the war. But in the foreground is dense planting, very dense planting. But the plants have been chosen because they're plants that don't mind getting wet from time to time. They enjoy a boost of rain water, storm water, flood water, and probably for the first time in 100 years, there are flowers here and butterflies visiting. It's it's really lovely. But the park's been left deliberately plain so that future residents can have more of a say about what kind of facilities that they would like in the park. And you can see the same area, the same site in the 1950s, once again confirming that wet nature of Montague. But this is well understood, this is well being planned for, and all the gamut of approaches are being taken towards future flooding and sea level rise. So these planted areas, such as I've shown, the treatment of the gravity tower, would be a range of such measures that acknowledge that flooding is a recurrent feature of Montague and not shying away from that fact, but planning for it at the same time. Here are children leaving the South Melbourne Primary School, and it's also envisaged in the future that in Montague, public transport, walking and cycling will be the main ways to get around. So when the school was built, Yarra Trams reconfigured the tram stop so that children could literally get off the tram, down the ramp and into school without, they can, perhaps it looks like they'd have to go on the road, but they just go through here into school. So no roads to cross, creating a safe environment for those children. And as you can see, many people are choosing to walk and ride to school. Unfortunately, the tram stop that's just out of the slide on the left is not so hospitable as the one that has been refurbished. The streets have been narrowed to make cars travel more, to encourage cars to travel more slowly. Unfortunately, some still speed round this corner, which is concerning. But the future of Montague is imagined, if you almost take cues from that past, as a community with many, many people, but where the streets will once again be welcoming to community activity, and where communities will be forged through community facilities and institutions. So the communities of the future will be vertical rather than horizontal, but communities we hope they'll be. So I'm now approaching the end and encourage you most earnestly to visit Montague, the exhibition Montague, A Community Lost and Found, and to meet some of the people of whom I've spoken today in the film. You'll be enriched by it, I'm sure, as I have been. And just to conclude, I'll refresh the journey we've taken today. We started here in Port Melbourne. We crossed Boundary Street to walk along Gladstone Street. Then we took a brief detour up onto the platform of the Montague station, then returned down Montague Street to Buckhurst Street. Then we went along Buckhurst Street to George, down George Street, along Thistlethwaite to the school, and then along the boundary of the school to Kirrip Park, where we conclude the walk. So I'm now going to stop screen sharing and say thank you very, very much for attending this walk, Montague, A Community Lost and Found.